Chapter 5 Kashmir. This was Mr. Cracroft Wilson's second journey to New Zealand. He had come 4 years earlier when on leave from his duties as a judge, and bought a sheep run to which he gave an Indian name, Kashmir. On his first ship, the Akbar, he had brought a real menagerie of animals, including antelopes, peacocks, and partridges, for he looked forward to hunting as well as farming. But except for some of the peacocks, they'd all died. And this time he had brought from India only 2 hares in a cage and an Indian ass, a pale-looking fellow with a dark stripe running right down his back from his mane to his tail. The poor jackass shivered in his pen, and Archie had to spend much time soothing him. The voyage was a fast one, taking only 9 days, mostly under full sail, but with the engine in use one day when the wind fell. The Phipps family kept to themselves. Mr. Cracroft Wilson and his cabin passengers were too grand, and the Indian servants too strange for these Australian stockmen. This did not trouble Mrs. Phipps, who had asked for nothing more than somewhere to go. She had agreed that they would work at Kashmir for 6 months, the older boys and herself. Kashmir was short of labor. One of the main ideas behind the planning of the Canterbury settlement was to bring out the right mixture of masters and workmen. But this had not worked very well, partly because too many of the workmen had gone off to Australia looking for gold. Here, for once, was an Australian family coming in the right direction. Many people came out to admire the Armenian as she sailed up to Lyttelton Harbour with a brisk nor'easter filling her sails. To the Phipps family, the first glimpse of Lyttelton was just as beautiful. After the bare cliffs at the heads and the steep brown tussocky hills, they came quite suddenly onto the little port, rather like a tiny copy of Sydney, with its houses scattered over the hillsides, a few hotels and stores, 2 jetties, and a number of small boats on the water. The Armenian furled her sails and came slowly alongside under steam. Mr. and Mrs. Cracroft Wilson were handed ashore and followed by the other cabin passengers, all bound for refreshment at the Mitre Hotel. Next, led by Indian servants in white clothes and turbans, came their splendid horses. This caused quite a stir, but most of the watchers had returned to their work by the time the donkeys were led off by the 3 young boys from Australia, and hardly anyone noticed that strange animal, the jackass. Mrs. Phipps, Emma, and Jim came last of all. The boys found a place to tether the donkeys and let them graze. The town, which still led Christchurch for size, was quite busy. There were 4 inns, each with its own stables and stockyards. Also, shipwrights, saddlers, business offices, and the printing works of the Lyttelton Times. Best of all in their eyes was a baker's shop with rolls still warm from the oven, and a dairy with fresh milk and butter and cheese. In Australia, Mrs. McCracken had teased them about going to the Shivery Isles. From the first moment ashore, Jim felt the ground slowly rocking from side to side. With alarm, he looked at his mother and brothers, but as they did not seem to be worrying, he held his tongue. Only when they reached the steep streets did the rocking become so bad that he grabbed at his mother's skirt. Big as he was terrified that he would slip and slide right down into the sea, which seemed to rise towards him. "Jim, don't drag on me so!" exclaimed Mrs. Phipps. Jim's eyes grew wide and scary. "I've got to hold on! The earthquake's going to throw me over!" "Earthquake? There isn't any earthquake!" "There is!" screamed Jim, and he let go and lurched right into the clay of the road. Jack sprang out to catch him before he could be hurt by the wheel of a dray going past. "It's the waves, stupid! You can feel them rocking still." "Come, we'll sit down till it goes off," said Mrs. Phipps kindly. And they found a bench outside the Canterbury Hotel, where Jim turned his face to the wall to hide his confusion. Here they were found by a shepherd from Kashmir who had come to show them the way. This part of the journey was straightforward but slow. Most of their things were packed onto the donkeys, with room on the quietest one for Emma to ride. As for the others, they must walk. The donkeys were in no hurry, but the jackass, which nature had intended for a fast-running animal, took quite a lot of holding. Like all pioneers, they climbed the bridle path which crossed the hills to the plains. At every pass there was an enchanting view of the harbor. It was like a long arm reaching from the sea, with 3 fingers outstretched at the end, and Quail Island humped up in the middle with steep cliffs and a crown of tussock. Most of the highest hills were topped by rocky crags, with Mount Herbert the craggiest and highest of them all, rising above the southern shore. The family rested at the top of the bridle path, while the donkeys nosed about among the tussock. Below, for mile after mile, the plains stretched out towards the foot of the snowy ranges. They looked bare and dull. The new town of Christchurch in the distance showed only a few buildings dotted among the flax and cabbage trees and patches of swamp. 2 small ships were sailing across the estuary of the Avon and Heathcote rivers, and in the distance the great Waimakariri River shone silver. After Berrima, which had always been colorful with its oranges and gum blossom, its bottlebrush and rolling pastures, Christchurch was desolate. Mrs. Phipps looked back at the blue waters where the Armenian lay, very small in the distance against the wharf, and at the green patches around the bays where grass or crops had been planted. "I'd sooner be there," she said, "on a sunny slope with a breeze coming in from the sea." But they had to go down to the hills to the Heathcote River, and missing Christchurch out entirely, follow along the edge of the plains to a lonely valley and a few station buildings scattered around. Kashmir, which meant employment and a roof over their heads. It was not really much of a roof, although in those times a station hand would be lucky to find anything better. They were taken to a big, drafty barracks with rough bunks slung with sacking and given a meal of mutton and potatoes. Dusk had set in before the donkeys and the jackass were safely housed in a barn. They could not be left out in the chilly sudden evening after coming from Australia. But for their attendants, there was neither fire nor light. The cook was an Indian who had come with Mr. Cracroft Wilson on his first journey. He had a way of coming and going among the bare walls and the shadows in perfect silence. This was too much for Emma, who had been beautifully behaved on board ship. She stood by her bunk and screamed. Nothing would make her stay in it. She wanted to jump out, to run, and find her own cot, which had been left behind at Berrima. "Cot! Cot!" she cried. When all the other soothing failed, Mrs. Phipps had a regular answer: to sing. Now tired out, as she was herself, she laid the rag doll Bibi in the bunk and sang to it. "Up and down the city road and into the weasel. That is how the money's spent. Pop goes the weasel." The word "pop" was said with a comical face, and soon the screams died away and Emma was singing to Bibi too. Then Mrs. Phipps took Emma in her arms and rocked her, still singing, until Emma had no pop left in her, for she was fast asleep. The next morning work began. It had nothing to do with the donkeys or the jackass, which to Archie's great disappointment were left in the barn. They were cutting the tough, stiff blades of the flax. The fertile, sunny valleys were heavy swamp where the flax grew tall enough to hide a horse and his rider. Before they could be drained, plowed, and sown with grass, the leaves must be cut by hand, tied in bundles, and rafted down the Heathcote River to a mill. Mrs. Phipps, Bill, Jack, and Archie were kept busy while Jim had to take care of Emma. It was not much fun in the swamp. The children soon grew tired of playing hide-and-seek or of trying to catch the bright blue pukakos who stalked all over the place. But they could not be left at the barracks either, for Emma was afraid of it even in daylight, and the farmhands chased them away from the barns and the stables. Kashmir was a cruel disappointment. Backs were sore, arms were sore, hands were blistered, and Jack's bruised shoulder began to ache all over again. Bill grumbled that the gold fields could not possibly be worse. Mrs. Phipps encouraged them by saying cheerfully that in 6 months the contract would be finished, with enough money to begin a home. But at nights, lying on her bunk, she calculated that with wages so low, it would be likely to take 5 years of saving. What troubled her most was that she could not watch the children properly. When in the second week Emma began waking with nightmares, she decided that it was time to talk to Mr. Cracroft Wilson, the Nabob, as people called him in this little domain, which he ruled with all the dignity of an Indian prince. As it happened, before she could seek him out, the nabob came looking for her. He was very angry, for his overseer had been thrown off his horse and had put blame on Jim, shouting around the stable yard and causing the animal to shy. "You must keep your children under better control, Mrs. Phipps," he stormed. She seized her opportunity. "I do my best, sir, but this is no place for children." "What would you have? A nursery?" he said loftily. "No, I would have work and quarters more suited to my training, where I could look after them properly. I don't need any more cooks or house servants. My Indians do very well. I'm an expert with the garden, sir. Flowers, fruit and vegetables, and poultry. I don't wish to break my contract. I only wish to be more useful and to give my children a respectable home." "A garden?" he said. Mr. Cracroft Wilson was thinking. "This woman isn't of much use. It's the boys I need. The children are better out of it." He looked over towards the hills. "There's a place over the saddle there, I believe, that belongs to me. 68 acres of land and nearly all of it rough. 2 of my men put up a cob cottage and planted some potatoes, and then cleared out to the Australian diggings. I can't spare any more men, so if 1 room and a chimney will do you, you're welcome to try." 1 room and a chimney. Well, that was enough to begin with, thought Mrs. Phipps. She could make a home out of that. "Is it near the harbor?" she asked. "Yes, Governor's Bay, some 7 miles, I believe. It's hardly worth my looking at. You must take my overseer's word for it." "And I may take all the children?" "The children, Mrs. Phipps. The 2 grown boys, Bill and Jack, will remain here to fulfill their contract." She saw that she must move carefully now. "I must talk to them," she said. "If they are agreeable, your offer suits me very well, sir." "You must talk to them!" Mr. Cracroft Wilson exploded. "I must remind you, there's a contract that they work for me. That was the condition for your boarding the Armenian. We don't break our word, but, sir, you see that a contract has 2 sides. I'll be too far away myself to see their needs. I ask for your word that they'll be well fed and clothed and housed." The nabob's eyes flashed. No employee had ever told him what he must do, but he had his own dignity to keep. "They're already fed and housed," he said. "They'll need warm work clothes with the winter coming," said Mrs. Phipps calmly. "I offer you a house, and you try to exact fresh conditions?" "I'm grateful for your offer, sir. Please believe me. But I'm a widow woman, and I must leave behind the best hands in my family. I must leave the boys here without protection except from you. You're a man of honor, I know it. Give me that promise, and never fear. You won't regret the bargain. Your wilderness will be made to blossom for you." Angry as he was, the nabob knew that this was good sense. "Very well," he said. "Your boys shall have what is needful. When the 6 months have expired, we'll look into your position again. You can take that place over there as your cottage. But don't forget, it's my property." End of chapter 5.